The wind rolled in salty and soft over the sleepy harbor town of Willow Bay, carrying with it the scent of seaweed, rusted anchors, and secrets long buried beneath the waves. It was the kind of place where nothing much changed. Boats left at dawn, returned at dusk. Children ran barefoot down cracked sidewalks, and everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Catherine Hallwell had lived in Willow Bay her entire life. She was the kind of woman people didn't cross unless they wanted the whole town whispering about it by dinner. Widowed 5 years earlier, she lived alone in a 2-story cottage with blue shutters and an immaculate rose garden. Her late husband, Captain Richard Hallwell, had served in the Navy with honor, and she carried that legacy like a badge. Routine was her sanctuary, and any ripple in that still water was an offense she didn't take lightly. That morning, Catherine had set out for her usual walk along the marina. It was her way of staying connected to Richard. He'd loved this place. With her cardigan buttoned tightly and a shopping bag in hand, she passed the bakery, the post office, and finally arrived at the pier, where the fishing boats were beginning to drift back in. That's when she saw him. The boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, standing at the far end of the pier, hunched over the edge with a fishing rod clutched between his thin fingers. His jeans were too short, frayed at the ankles. His shirt hung off one shoulder. And his face was smudged with salt and dirt, eyes scanning the horizon like he was waiting for someone who'd never come. Catherine squinted. She had seen him before. A few times, in fact. Always alone. Always silent. Some said he was the son of a fisherman who died at sea. Others said he had no parents at all, just an old uncle who drank too much and forgot to feed him. No one really knew. And in a town like Willow Bay, that was enough to make you suspicious. As she walked closer, her eyes caught something glinting in the boy's pocket. It was quick, a flicker of silver, but unmistakable. A pocket watch. But not just any pocket watch. Her heart skipped. It looked exactly like Richard's. She froze mid-step. She had kept that watch in a small velvet box, tucked away in her top drawer. It hadn't been moved in years. Last night, however, she had looked for it, wanting to feel close to Richard. But it was gone. She had torn her house apart in a quiet storm of confusion and fury. And now, here it was, or something very like it, hanging from the pocket of a boy who had no business having it. Her voice cut through the quiet like a ship's horn. "You there, boy. Stop." The boy stiffened. Slowly, he turned, wide-eyed, as Catherine approached with determined steps. He didn't run. He just stared at her with the kind of hollow gaze that could belong to someone much older than 11. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, pointing to the silver chain now barely visible in his pocket. The boy blinked. "What?" "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped. "The watch. My husband's watch. I saw it." He stepped back slightly, 1 foot inching toward the edge of the pier. "I didn't take anything." Catherine's voice rose, carried by the wind and the years of grief she had never really faced. "You think I wouldn't recognize it? You little thief. Do you even know what that watch means? What it's worth?" By now, a few heads had turned. An older man tying up his boat looked over. A teenager on a bike slowed down, but no one intervened. This was Catherine Hallwell, after all, and he was just some ragged boy. The boy's lip trembled. He reached into his pocket slowly, hesitantly, and pulled the watch into view. It wasn't exactly like Richard's, she realized. The chain was longer, the engravings different, but it was close enough to spark doubt and fire in a heart still heavy with sorrow. "Please," he said, his voice small. "It was my father's. He gave it to me before he—" "Lies," Catherine hissed. "You expect me to believe that? You think I was born yesterday." A single tear slid down the boy's cheek, but she didn't see it, or maybe she refused to. "Thieves like you don't belong here," she spat. "You take and take, and no one holds you accountable." "Well, not today." She turned on her heel and stormed back down the pier, heels clicking like gunfire. She'd report this. To whom? She wasn't sure. The harbor master, the local police. It didn't matter. Someone would deal with the boy. Someone would make this right. Back at home, she slammed the door and collapsed into the armchair by the window. Her hands were shaking. Her chest was tight. That boy, he had no right. No right to remind her of everything she had lost. Of the life she had before silence filled the house. Before mornings without coffee for two. Before nights without laughter or the soft hum of Richard's voice reading the paper aloud. She closed her eyes, tried to breathe. But the image of the boy standing there, alone and trembling, wouldn't leave her mind. Nor would the watch. Was it truly Richard's? Could it be? But how would he have gotten it? Her mind swirled with questions, memories, and the heavy burden of years never healed. Night fell hard over Willow Bay, the sky dark and unrelenting. The waves lapped against the shore like the ticking of an invisible clock. Catherine didn't sleep. Not really. She paced. She stared at the empty drawer where the watch should have been. She replayed the boy's face over and over. And then, just as the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, there was a knock at the door. Firm. Deliberate. Not like a neighbor. Not like a friend. She froze. Another knock. Louder. She crept to the door, heart pounding. When she opened it, she didn't expect to see them. Two men in navy uniforms stood on her porch. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone was enough to make her throat tighten. "Mrs. Hallwell?" the taller one asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes, can I help you?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. He handed it to her. It was old, faded, a man in uniform, a young boy beside him. Her breath caught. "We're looking for this boy," the officer said. "His name is Luca. We believe you may have spoken to him yesterday." Catherine stared at the photo, then at the men. "Why are the Navy looking for him?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before speaking again. "Because, Mom, he's not just any boy." And the man standing beside him, he wasn't just a sailor. He was one of ours. And he died a hero. Catherine's knees buckled slightly. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew began to crumble. Not just about the boy, but about the watch, about her town, about herself. The truth was rising, like the tide, and there was no stopping it now. Catherine's fingers trembled as she held the photograph, the edges curling with age, the ink slightly faded, but the image was crystal clear. There was no mistaking the resemblance. The boy in the picture, standing beside a tall, broad-shouldered man in a Navy uniform, was the same one she had accused just a day before. Luca, his eyes in the photograph carried the same quiet sorrow she'd seen at the pier. Only now that sorrow held weight, a story, a truth that hung heavily in the air between her and the two Navy officers standing on her porch. She couldn't speak. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. The taller officer, who had introduced himself as Commander Ellis, gently stepped forward and took the photo back, sliding it into his folder. "We're sorry to come unannounced, Mom," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "But this is urgent. We've been searching for the boy for months." Catherine's brows knit together, confusion and guilt clashing in her chest. "Why?" she finally managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why is the Navy looking for a child?" The second officer, a younger man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, answered, "Because his father, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Marlowe, died during a classified mission overseas, and before he passed, he left behind something important, something meant only for his son." Catherine stared at them, her mind racing. "But I don't understand. What does that have to do with me? With yesterday?" Ellis exhaled, as though he had rehearsed this speech many times, but never quite knew how it would land. "Because before his death, Officer Marlowe recorded a message for Luca, a message that revealed something critical. He named several individuals who served with honor, and a few who didn't. He spoke about corruption, betrayal, and one final request. He wanted the Navy to find his son and ensure he received the watch. A special watch, one with a hidden compartment inside. That's what Luca had when you confronted him, isn't it? Catherine's eyes widened. The watch. A chill rippled through her. She'd been so sure, so absolutely certain that Luca had stolen it. Her grief had sharpened her instincts into a blade, but now it was cutting in the wrong direction. I thought it was my husband's, she admitted quietly. He had one like it. I hadn't seen it in years. I'd assumed. Ellis nodded, his expression kind. Understandable. But that watch wasn't stolen. It was passed down. Officer Marlowe entrusted it to a man in Willow Bay before his deployment. We believe that man was Luca's uncle, the same one who's recently gone missing. Her stomach turned. She remembered the rumors, that the boy lived with someone unstable, that no one really knew what went on in that small shack on the edge of town near the cliffs. I didn't know, she whispered, tears threatening to rise. I didn't know he was. He's just a boy. Yes, said the younger officer, but one who's been through more than most adults ever will. Catherine stepped aside. Come in, please. The two men entered her cottage, their presence foreign in the quiet, carefully arranged space. Photos of Richard lined the mantel. A folded American flag in a glass case sat by the fireplace. She suddenly felt exposed, hypocritical. Here she was, the proud widow of a Navy man, judging and condemning the son of another. As they sat, Ellis placed a small device on her coffee table and pressed a button. The voice filled the room. Rough, warm, familiar in that it carried the tone of a man who had lived with honor and pain. It was Daniel Marlowe. If you're hearing this, son, I'm sorry. I wish I could be there. But this world doesn't always let us choose the way we go. What matters is what we leave behind. This watch, don't let it go. Inside is a truth some would rather keep buried. I did things, good and bad. But I never stopped believing in doing what's right. You deserve to know where you come from, and you deserve a better life than what I had. Catherine's eyes welled up. Her hand clutched at her heart, the ache unbearable. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a legacy, a message, a key. She looked up at the officers. Do you know where he is now? Ellis hesitated. We have reason to believe he ran after the confrontation yesterday. He hasn't returned to the house. His school hasn't seen him in days, and his uncle is gone. We're working with local authorities now. But if he hears your voice, if you called out to him, we think he might come out of hiding. The idea of him hiding broke something inside her. I have to find him, she said, standing suddenly. I have to make this right. The search began that afternoon. Catherine drove to the pier first. It was deserted. The tide was higher now, the air thick with sea mist. She stood at the spot where she'd accused him, remembering every harsh word, every second of his silence as she hurled accusations. The wind whispered around her, but there was no sign of him. She searched the local park next, the library, the stretch of beach near the cliffs. At every stop, she asked. Most hadn't seen him. A few had. One woman said she'd seen him headed toward the old shipyard the night before, barefoot and alone. Catherine made her way there, heart pounding. The shipyard had long been abandoned, a tangle of rusted metal, hollow hulls, and forgotten tools. Dangerous, unstable. But if she had nowhere else to go, and no one left to trust, she might hide here too. She called his name, her voice echoing through the broken-down boats. Luca. Nothing. She tried again. Luca. It's Mrs. Hallwell. Please. I was wrong. Silence. Then, a faint sound. A shuffle. The creak of metal. She turned sharply, eyes scanning the gloom. And there he was, curled inside the skeleton of an old lifeboat, the watch clutched tightly in his palm, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. She stepped closer, slowly, hands raised. I'm not here to hurt you. He stared at her, not speaking. "I know now," she said, voice cracking. "I know the truth. About your father. About the watch. About you. And I'm sorry. I was so caught in my own grief that I couldn't see yours." He looked down. "Everyone thinks I'm trouble. Everyone is wrong sometimes," she whispered, "even me. But I want to help you now. Let me help you." Luca didn't speak for a long time, but slowly, hesitantly, he stood. His small hand didn't let go of the watch, but it did stretch out toward hers. She took it gently, wrapping his fingers in hers like he was made of glass. Outside the shipyard, a Navy vehicle was waiting. The two officers stepped forward, relief on their faces. As Catherine walked beside Luca, she realized something had shifted deep inside her. This wasn't just about redemption. This was about responsibility. About seeing people not for their past or their pain, but for who they could become when someone simply believed in them. The waves crashed softly in the distance as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. But it was real, and it was theirs. The days that followed unfolded like a slow breath after a storm, cautious, tender, and laced with quiet questions no one was ready to ask out loud. Catherine Hallwell hadn't expected to feel this way. She'd thought the apology would be the end of it. She'd imagined a simple goodbye, a return to her routines, the comfort of solitude stitched back into her days like it had always been. But Luca didn't let go of her hand when the Navy officers tried to take him. And when Commander Ellis gently explained that they needed to take the boy for questioning, for protection, for care, Luca had looked at Catherine with such a raw, unspoken plea in his eyes that something inside her cracked open completely. "I want to stay with her," he had whispered. Even now, remembering that moment made Catherine's throat tighten. It wasn't maternal instinct that had her stepping forward. It wasn't pity either. It was something deeper. A recognition. A realization that her grief had not only isolated her, it had made her blind. For years, she had mourned the loss of her husband, as if her pain were the only kind in the world. But now she stood face to face with a boy who had lost just as much, if not more. And he had lost it younger, harder, with less comfort and more silence. So when the Navy asked if she'd be willing to keep him for a while, just until things were sorted out, just until next of kin could be found or confirmed, she said yes. It wasn't the kind of yes you gave out of obligation. It was the kind of yes that came from somewhere ancient in the bones. The kind of yes that reshapes the heart. The first night, Luca slept on the living room couch, curled up beneath an old quilt that once belonged to Catherine's mother. She had placed a glass of water beside him, along with a nightlight and a plate of peanut butter crackers. He hadn't asked for anything. He just looked at her like he didn't believe any of it was real. She had checked on him twice during the night. The second time, he was whispering something in his sleep. A name, she thought. Maybe his father's. Maybe not. She stood in the doorway and listened for a while, unsure of what she was waiting to hear. The next morning, the silence between them was soft rather than sharp. Catherine made oatmeal, adding brown sugar and cinnamon the way Richard used to like it. She served it with toast and warm milk. Luca didn't say much. He ate slowly, glancing up at her occasionally, as if studying her face for signs of change. "Do you want to talk about him?" she asked quietly. Luca shrugged. "No one ever asks me that. I'm asking now." He hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "My dad said he was going to come back. He promised." She nodded, letting the silence hold the space between them. "He used to tell me stories," he went on, "about ships and storms, and how he once saved a dog from drowning in the middle of a hurricane." Catherine's eyes twinkled. "Did he really?" "I think so," Luca said with a small smile. He always said people underestimate dogs. They're stronger swimmers than you'd think. They both chuckled softly, the tension loosening in the air like fog lifting from the harbor. That day, they walked to the pier together. Luca showed her the exact spot where he always fished. He pointed to a crate he used as a stool, tucked behind a stack of old lobster traps. There was a tackle box nearby, filled with rusted hooks and a few hand-tied flies that Luca had made himself. "I come here because it's quiet," he said. "It's the only place where no one yells." Catherine's face flushed, remembering the way her own voice had echoed off the wooden planks just days earlier. "You deserve better than yelling," she said softly. "You deserve someone who listens." Luca didn't reply, but his shoulders relaxed. He kicked a pebble into the water and watched it sink. Later that evening, they sat together on the porch as the sun slipped behind the trees. Catherine sipped chamomile tea, while Luca doodled in a notebook he found on a shelf in her study. He drew ships, big ones, small ones, some with flags and others with broken sails. His hands moved quickly, as though trying to capture something that might disappear if he hesitated. "You're good," she said, watching his pencil dance. He shrugged. "I used to draw for my dad. He kept one of my pictures in his locker. A submarine. Said it gave him luck." A lump formed in her throat. "I'm sure it did." Just as the last light of day faded, there was a soft knock at the door. Commander Ellis stood on the porch again, this time alone. His face was grim. "We found something," he said. Catherine stepped aside, her stomach already sinking. Inside, Ellis placed a sealed envelope on the table. It was addressed to Luca in thick, weathered handwriting. A Navy seal was pressed into the wax. "We believe this was meant to be delivered with the watch. It was left in a safe deposit box under Marlowe's name, discovered just yesterday during a routine audit. His will instructed that it be given only to Luca, or to someone he trusted to read it first." Catherine picked it up gently. She glanced at Luca, who was watching her with wide eyes. "Do you want me to read it to you?" she asked. He nodded. She broke the seal carefully, unfolded the letter, and began to read. "My dearest Luca, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come home like I promised, and for that I'm sorry. I never wanted to leave you. I fought like hell not to. But life doesn't always give us the endings we deserve. You are braver than I ever was. Smarter, too. And I need you to know something. This watch isn't just mine. It's ours. Inside it is a map, not to gold or treasure, but to something more important. The truth about what happened to my ship, to my crew, and why some men never made it home. That truth is dangerous. People will want to keep it hidden. But I believe in you. I believe you'll know what to do. Find the lighthouse in Willow Bay, the one with the boarded-up windows and the broken weather vane. Underneath the main floor, there's a trapdoor. It leads to a journal. My journal. Everything is in there. Trust your heart. And if you find someone you can trust with it, don't let them go. All my love. Dad." Catherine looked up from the letter. Luca's face was pale, but his eyes burned with something new. Purpose. "A map," he said. "A trapdoor." Catherine nodded slowly. "The old lighthouse hasn't been used in years. Most people think it's condemned. Then that's where we have to go," Luca said, standing. "Tonight." Catherine blinked. "Now." Dad wouldn't have said it if it wasn't important. She looked at the boy before her, no longer just a frightened child, but someone stepping into the fire of truth with more courage than she'd seen in years. She stood too. "I'll get the flashlight." And together, under a starless sky, they set out toward the forgotten edge of Willow Bay. Neither of them knew what waited in the shadows of the lighthouse. But they walked anyway, side by side, bound by the kind of connection that neither time nor tragedy could break. Because some stories don't end. They only change course. The road to the lighthouse was overgrown and forgotten, like time had wrapped its vines around it and decided to erase it from memory. Every few feet, Catherine had to slow the car to a crawl as they navigated cracked asphalt and wild branches clawing at the windows. Luca sat in the passenger seat, his hand still gripping the old watch like it was his anchor to the world. Neither of them spoke much. The hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires filled the space between their thoughts. When the lighthouse finally emerged from the trees, it looked like something out of a ghost story, tall and leaning, its once white surface now stained with streaks of rust and mildew. The windows were all either shattered or boarded up, and the roof of the adjoining keeper's house sagged like a tired sigh. The broken weather vane atop the tower twisted slowly in the wind, squealing every few seconds like it was crying out to be remembered. Catherine parked the car a few yards away and turned off the engine. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, looking at Luca. He nodded without hesitation. "This is what he wanted me to find." They stepped out into the cool night air. The smell of salt and damp earth hung heavy around them. Catherine grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and handed Luca a smaller one. She had also brought an old crowbar, not sure what they might need to break into or out of. The wooden door to the lighthouse creaked open with less resistance than expected. Inside, it smelled of rot and old memories. Dust floated in the flashlight beams like fireflies. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floor groaned beneath their feet. It was the kind of place no one visited anymore, except for ghosts or boys chasing the last whispers of their fathers. They moved slowly through the ground floor, checking for any sign of a trapdoor. Old furniture lay in broken heaps, covered in sheets that had long since turned gray with age. Catherine felt the silence pressing in on her, like the building itself was holding its breath. "Over here," Luca whispered suddenly. He was kneeling beside a cracked linoleum tile near the back of the main room. He brushed away layers of dust and debris, revealing a square outline in the floor. A small metal ring sat flush in the center. Catherine knelt beside him. "This is it." She wedged the crowbar into the seam and pried upward. The wood creaked loudly, protesting the disturbance. After a few seconds of struggle, the trapdoor gave way, revealing a narrow wooden staircase descending into blackness. The smell that rose from below was older than mildew. It smelled like forgotten time. Catherine shined her flashlight down. "Stay close." They descended carefully, the steps creaking beneath them, the air growing cooler with every foot. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small cellar with stone walls and a low ceiling. Shelves lined one side, filled with old nautical equipment, ropes, lanterns, maps browned with age. In the far corner was a weathered wooden chest. Luca crossed the room and knelt before it. The lock was broken. He lifted the lid with both hands. Inside was a journal, bound in dark leather, the cover cracked from years of handling. A small stack of photographs lay beneath it, some showing men in uniform, others capturing distant shores and unknown faces. Luca picked up the journal and opened it slowly. The first page was inscribed in the same handwriting as the letter. "If I don't make it home, tell my son everything. The truth, no matter how dangerous, is still the truth." Catherine stood behind him, reading over his shoulder as he turned the pages. The entries were detailed. They spoke of missions gone wrong, names of officers who took bribes, who sabotaged operations to cover their tracks. One name appeared more than once: Commander Brigham. According to the journal, he had orchestrated an illegal arms trade during one of their overseas deployments, then framed innocent crewmen to avoid suspicion. One of the scapegoats was Daniel Marlowe. "My dad was blamed for something he didn't do," Luca murmured. Catherine placed a hand on his shoulder. "And he risked everything to make sure you'd know." Further into the journal, Marlowe described a hidden flash drive, encrypted and protected, that contained digital copies of classified communications. It was buried beneath the pier where he used to take Luca fishing, the same place Catherine had confronted him just days ago. "He left everything in plain sight," Catherine said, her voice laced with awe. "Right under everyone's noses." A soft creak from above made them both freeze. Footsteps. Someone was in the lighthouse. Luca's flashlight flicked off. Catherine instantly turned hers toward the stairs, her heart thudding hard in her chest. "Maybe it's Ellis," Luca whispered, but Catherine shook her head. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whoever was up there wasn't calling out. There were no navy boots echoing through the floorboards. This was someone else. She quickly closed the chest and pushed it back into its corner. "Hide," she whispered. They ducked behind an old shelving unit, just as a shadow passed over the trapdoor. The figure stepped down one stair, then another. Catherine held her breath. A man appeared, tall, broad, wearing a civilian jacket and boots coated with dried mud. He carried a flashlight of his own, sweeping it around the cellar slowly. Catherine didn't recognize him, but Luca did. "That's my uncle," he whispered, his voice trembling. The man's face was hard, his eyes darting. "Luca?" he called, voice low and rough. "Boy, I know you're here. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have gone digging." Catherine reached into her coat pocket and slowly pulled out her phone. No signal. The thick stone walls had killed the reception. Luca's uncle moved further into the room, passing within feet of them. "I told your father this would happen," he muttered. "Told him they'd come after you too." But he never listened. He turned suddenly toward the shelves. Catherine acted without thinking. She pushed the shelf with all her strength. It tipped, slamming into the man with a crash. He stumbled back, cursing, pinned against the wall. "Run," she shouted, grabbing Luca's hand. They bolted up the stairs, flashlight beams jerking wildly in front of them. Behind them, the man yelled in anger, wood splintering as he fought to break free. Catherine and Luca burst out of the trapdoor and slammed it shut behind them. She shoved the nearest piece of furniture over it and grabbed Luca's arm. They sprinted through the main room, out the door, and into the open night. The moment they reached the car, Catherine threw it into reverse and spun the wheel. Tires skidded across gravel as the lighthouse shrank behind them. The front door flung open, Luca's uncle silhouetted against the flickering light. They didn't stop driving until they were back in town, parked in front of the police station. Catherine was out of the car before the engine even stopped, hauling the journal under one arm and pulling Luca close with the other. Inside, Commander Ellis met them with a shocked expression. "What happened?" Catherine handed him the journal. "You need to see this. Now." Ellis took it, flipping through the pages, his expression darkening. "Where did you get this?" "From the place Daniel wrote about," Catherine said. "And there's more. A flash drive under the pier, but someone else knows about it. Luca's uncle. He came after us tonight." Ellis didn't hesitate. He turned to the officer behind him. "Lock down the pier. I want a team on that flash drive immediately. And get me a warrant for that lighthouse." As officers scrambled, Ellis looked at Luca and Catherine again. This time, not with the detached professionalism of duty, but with genuine respect. "You did the right thing," he said. Catherine glanced down at Luca, whose eyes were red but determined. "No," she replied. "He did." The dawn broke like a sigh over Charleston, casting pale gold across rooftops and waking the harbor in slow motion. But Catherine and Luca hadn't slept. They sat side by side on the bench outside the police station, both wrapped in identical wool blankets the officers had handed them hours ago. Coffee steamed in paper cups between their hands, forgotten. The adrenaline had faded, but its residue still clung to them, an invisible hum in the blood. Catherine could still see the look on Commander Ellis's face when he emerged from the back room after reading the journal in full, shocked, grim, and finally, resolved. "We've verified the names," he had told them. The entries match with a number of unexplainable events that were buried deep, too deep. It wasn't just a matter of corruption now. It was conspiracy. Years of cover-ups, forged reports, silenced witnesses, and Luca's father had known it all. He hadn't just written a journal. He'd been building a case, a quiet, painful one, done in shadows with the knowledge it might never see the light. The flash drive had been recovered hours ago, buried exactly where the journal said it would be, under a rotting beam at the far end of the pier, wrapped in plastic and sealed in a rusted Altoids tin. The encryption was sophisticated, almost military grade. It would take time to crack. But what it meant was clear. Daniel Marlowe hadn't abandoned his son. He had died trying to protect him. Catherine turned to look at Luca, who was staring out at the morning haze with his chin resting on his knees. His hair was a mess, and his face looked far older than his years. But there was something in his eyes now. Resolve. Like some ancient fire had been kindled inside him. "They're going to find out everything now," he said quietly. "The truth." Catherine nodded. "Because of you." A long pause passed between them before he added, "I don't know what happens next." "Neither do I," she admitted. "But we'll figure it out." The door behind them opened, and Ellis stepped out, his uniform immaculate despite the sleepless night. "We've got enough to begin formal proceedings," he said, his voice low. "Your uncle's in custody, Luca. He was intercepted trying to get back to the lighthouse with a duffel bag full of hard drives and old documents. Turns out, he was part of the laundering operation your father uncovered. We think he tried to destroy what was left." Luca's jaw clenched. "Did he know my dad was trying to expose him?" Ellis hesitated. "Yes. We believe that's why your father's final mission was sabotage. It wasn't just an accident, Luca. It was deliberate." The words hit hard, but there was no breakdown, no tears this time. Just silence. "We'll need you both to testify at some point," Ellis continued. "But for now, you're safe. We've arranged protective custody if you want it." Catherine shook her head. "We'll stay at my house. No one will find him there. And I think he needs something familiar." Ellis didn't argue. "All right, but we'll post a plainclothes unit nearby, just in case." As the commander walked away, Luca looked up at Catherine. "Do you think my dad knew I'd find all this?" he asked. "I think he hoped you would," she said. "But he couldn't be sure. That's why he wrote everything down. Why he left you the watch. He believed in you, Luca. Enough to bet his life on it." They drove home in silence. The roads felt different now, like they belonged to a new world. One where nothing was simple, but where everything had more meaning. Back at Catherine's house, the stillness wrapped around them like a warm coat. She made pancakes, real ones this time, not from a mix, and set them on the table with maple syrup and fresh strawberries. Luca ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if every flavor connected him to something lost. After breakfast, he asked if he could go sit by the pier. Catherine hesitated, but nodded. "I'll be close." He took the watch with him. Out on the dock, Luca sat at the edge and dangled his feet over the water. The breeze carried the scent of salt and old wood. He turned the watch over in his hands, tracing the initials carved into the back. DM. He pressed the tiny clasp on the side again, revealing the hidden compartment that once held the note. This time, it was empty, but not meaningless. For a long time, he stared at the water. It didn't shimmer the way it had when he was younger. It didn't whisper like it used to, but it was still his place. His father's place. The place where secrets had waited patiently to be discovered. Catherine watched from the window, the journal in her lap. She'd read every page. Some twice, others 3 times. Daniel Marlowe had been more than just a father or a soldier. He had been a man haunted by truths no one wanted to hear. And still, he'd chosen to leave a path behind, not for revenge, but for justice. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived. It was hand-delivered by a naval officer in a clean envelope. Catherine opened it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was an official Navy commendation. Posthumous. For bravery. For honor. For uncovering internal operations in violation of international and military law. It had taken years, but Daniel Marlowe's name was finally being cleared. Catherine walked the letter down to the pier herself. Luca took it silently, read every word, and nodded. Then, without saying a thing, he folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "I want to speak at the hearing," he said after a moment. Catherine blinked. "You don't have to." "I know. But I want to. I want people to know who he really was." "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "I'm not alone," Luca replied quietly. That night, Luca found something in the journal he hadn't noticed before. A pressed flower, faded and dry, tucked between two pages near the end. It was small, a forget-me-not. On the page next to it, a final scribbled sentence in his father's handwriting. For the things we leave behind, and the ones who find them. Luca closed the journal and held it against his chest. He didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't need them. He had the truth. He had Catherine. And he had the strength to carry the story forward. 3 months later, the courtroom was a cathedral of silence, the kind that made your pulse sound like thunder in your ears. The overhead lights glared off the polished wood, bouncing off the brass buttons of uniforms and the quiet gazes of men and women who had seen more than they would ever say. It wasn't the biggest courtroom in the state, but on this day, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath inside it. Catherine sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the accused, but on the boy standing behind the witness stand. Luca. He looked small behind the wide oak railing, but his voice was steady as he spoke. Not loud, not angry, just honest. Honest in the way people rarely are under oath, because he wasn't speaking from a script. He was speaking from memory, from pain, from truth. He was my father, he said to the packed room. But I never really knew him until after he was gone. The prosecutor had been hesitant about letting Luca testify. Too young, too fragile, too close to the story. But Catherine had fought for it. She knew it wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about voice. Luca's voice. Daniel Marlowe's voice. The voice that had been silenced too soon. He used to take me fishing, Luca continued. Even when he had to leave for long deployments, he'd always say, "We'll finish that catch when I get back." There were no tears, only a calm, deliberate telling. He found something in the Navy, something wrong, something people didn't want found. He wrote everything down. He left it for me. For all of us, so that no one else would have to be afraid to tell the truth. The judge sat back, watching with quiet interest. The defense team fidgeted, but no one interrupted. Not even the men in uniform seated behind the defendants, former officers, all facing dishonorable discharge, criminal charges, and worse. Catherine listened, holding her breath when Luca spoke the names from the journal. When he described the night at the lighthouse, when he looked the commander responsible for his father's death in the eye, and said, "You didn't just try to cover it up. You tried to bury the man who stood in your way." But he left roots behind. Outside the courthouse, the story had already spread. News crews lined the steps. Protesters held signs demanding reform, justice, answers. But inside, it was quiet enough to hear the pages of the court reporter's notes flutter when she turned them. When Luca stepped down from the witness stand, the entire room seemed to exhale. The judge nodded once, an acknowledgement not just of the boy's courage, but of the gravity of the moment. The proceedings continued. More witnesses, more evidence. Catherine gave her own testimony, detailing the moment she saw Luca holding that watch for the first time, how she'd accused him, how everything in her life had shifted after that single snap judgment. "I thought I was protecting the town," she told the court, "but I was protecting ignorance. I was wrong, and I will never forget what that mistake cost." By the end of the week, the verdicts began to fall. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Commander Brigham, the man who had manipulated operations, framed Daniel, and orchestrated years of cover-ups, was sentenced to life in a federal military prison. His expression didn't change as the sentence was read, but his hands trembled. The Navy issued a full posthumous exoneration of Daniel Marlowe. His name was entered into the record as a whistleblower and hero. The ceremony was scheduled for the following month, a formal acknowledgement in front of the nation. But Luca didn't wait for that. He stood at the water's edge on a quiet Sunday morning, just as the sun split the horizon into gold and coral. The same dock, the same worn planks under his feet, the same wind that once carried his father's voice to the waves. He held the journal in his hands. Not the original, but a freshly bound copy the Navy had made, each page preserved, catalogued, and stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice. Inside they had placed the flower too, the faded forget-me-not, laminated to protect it forever. Catherine stood nearby, silent, letting him have the moment. Luca knelt and placed the journal inside a watertight glass case, along with the old watch and a note of his own. He sealed the case and lowered it gently into the ocean with a rope weighted by stones. Not to discard it, but to return it. To the sea, he whispered. To where he lived. To where he fought. To where he still is. The waves took the case slowly, drawing it down into the depths. For a moment, the sunlight caught it just beneath the surface, sparkling like a star being born. And then it was gone. They stayed at the dock long after the sun was high. People from the town began to arrive, one by one at first, then in small groups. Not to stare, not to question, but to stand with them. To say, "We're here. We believe you. We remember now." An old man brought a flag, the one from Daniel Marlowe's service, and handed it to Luca. His hands trembled with age, but his voice was clear. "I served with your father," he said. "He was a good man. We failed him, but we won't fail you." Catherine watched as Luca nodded, his fingers clutching the folded flag tightly against his chest. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was reverent, sacred. Weeks later, Luca started speaking at schools, at community events, on podcasts, not to talk about revenge or sorrow, but about truth, about the power of one voice, about the cost of silence. He didn't call himself a survivor or a victim. He called himself a witness. Catherine was by his side through all of it, sometimes guiding, sometimes just watching, but always proud, always changed. The boy she had once accused of stealing had grown into the kind of person this world desperately needed, quietly brave, undeniably honest, and unafraid to stand for what was right, even when it hurt. One evening, they stood together on her porch, looking out at the horizon where the sea touched the sky. "I still miss him," Luca said softly. "You always will," Catherine replied. "But he's part of you now. He's in everything you do." Luca didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Do you think he'd be proud of me?" Catherine smiled, her eyes misting. "I don't think. I know." A breeze rolled in from the harbor, lifting the corners of the flag resting on the table beside them. In the distance, a ship's horn echoed over the water, long and low. And somewhere beneath the waves, in the quiet deep, a story lay resting, safe, remembered, and finally, whole.